In the previous lecture, we looked at the response of Christianity to Greek learning, particularly in natural philosophy. We saw that there were in fact a variety of responses, from rejection to assimilation. In the end, natural philosophy became one of several ancilli, that is to say, handmaidens to the practice of religion, to theology in particular. The Christian world throughout the Middle Ages chose spiritual goals as the greatest good. And so everything else was to be a help to that. Natural philosophy, not pursued for its own sake, but rather for how it could support theological and spiritual ideas. In this and the next three lectures, we're going to turn to the other monotheistic world religion, that is Islam, and examine the history of science there. We shall see that early Muslims had to respond to pagan culture the same way that Christians had to do. Now, remember what I said in the first lecture about the impossibility of separating the history of science and the history of technology from other historical developments. Science and technology don't develop in a vacuum. They have to be related to broader developments on a cultural level going on in the societies where the science and the technology are developed and practiced. Therefore, in part of this lecture, I'm going to have to devote some time to setting the stage for Islamic science by talking about the history of the early Islamic empire. So then, let me begin there. The Islamic Empire, sometimes called the House of Islam, the Darul Islam in Arabic, expanded outward from the Arabian Peninsula with astonishing speed throughout the 7th and 8th centuries. It eventually spanned a realm from Spain to India, across North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, and everything in between. Of course, Islam begins with the revelations to the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad was born in 570, died in 632. The Islamic era, the Islamic calendar, begins from the so-called Hijrah, that is the flight of Muhammad from the city of Mecca to the city of Medina, and that was in 622. So that's the beginning of the Islamic era. After Muhammad's death, after some rather violent negotiations about who would be his successor, the Caliph, the successor of Muhammad, Muslim armies moved out of the Arabian Peninsula, northward through the Levant, westward across North Africa, eastward into Persia. Now, I don't want history to devolve into a set of dates and battles. Nonetheless, I think it's important here to fix for you the rapid expanse of Islam, for me to read a few dates at which particular places were annexed to the Islamic Empire. It'll give you an idea of how rapidly and how in every direction it spread. Right, now remember, Muhammad dies in 632. By 4 years later, the city of Damascus becomes annexed in 636. 638, Jerusalem. After that, the island of Cyprus in 640. Shortly thereafter, Muslim fleets close in the harbor at Constantinople, the very capital of the Byzantine Empire. Throughout the 670s, Constantinople was blockaded. Eventually, the Muslims were defeated there. They returned with another fleet in 718 and were absolutely decimated by the Constantinople forces. I'm paying particular attention to this because there was a technological reason for the Greek successes those two times. It lay in a particular substance known as Greek fire. We don't actually know what Greek fire was chemically, what it was made up of. All we know is that it was very effective because it completely annihilated the Muslim fleet in 718. It was apparently a sticky, incredibly inflammable substance that would be shot out of a siphon, stick to the side or the deck of a wooden ship, and set it on fire. Apparently it was so flammable that it was difficult or impossible to put out with water. The reason we don't know what its actual composition was is that it was entrusted to a single family to make it, because naturally enough, it was a state secret, like making atomic weapons would be nowadays. And so the secret died with them. But nonetheless, it did save the city of Constantinople. It was 700 years later that Muslims finally took the city, and that was only after the rise of the Turks. So that stopped the progress of Islam northward. To the west, the city of Alexandria fell in 640, then Carthage, one of St. Augustine's cities, in 697. The Muslim armies crossed the Straits of Gibraltar to take Toledo, the Visigothic capital of Spain, in 711. Most of the rest of Spain in 718, and then they were stopped again near the French city of Tours by a Frankish army in 732, and that ended the expansion of Islam into Europe. Again, towards the east, Persia, all the way to India, was taken as well. So now, vast empire created in a very short period of time. There are a couple of things that are important to recognize about this empire. First of all, for the first couple of centuries, outside of the Arab Peninsula, the majority of the subjects of the Islamic Empire were neither Arabs nor Muslims. Large proportions of them were Persians, Christians, Greeks, all different kinds of peoples and of different religions. What is of importance is that this allowed for significant cross-cultural exchanges in an atmosphere of relative peace over a long period of time. In other words, Islam grew so quickly, everybody obviously wasn't converting as the armies moved. And so Christians, Jews, and Muslims and pagans lived alongside each other for a long period. But it was more than just living alongside of one another. The first dynasty of caliphs, the Umayyad dynasty, set up its capital not in Arabia, but in Damascus. It was set up there in 661 by Muawiyah, who was the second Umayyad caliph. He actually started out being the governor of Syria, so naturally he put his capital where it felt safe, in Damascus. Now, moreover, the Arab tribes really, they were wonderful warriors, but they didn't have any experience of how to govern an empire. So, who ran the government? Well, it turned out that it was largely Byzantine Greeks, many of them Christians, who ended up being the administrators for the Umayyads in Damascus. This cross-cultural exchange became even more important, perhaps, when the Umayyads were overthrown in 750 by the next dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty. The last Umayyad emir, the only one left alive, fled and set up an emirate in Spain, where the Umayyads survived for the next 500 years. Nonetheless, the Abbasids moved the capital now far to the east, again to put it in friendly territory because they had been supported by non-Arabs in their revolution. In 762, the second Abbasid caliph, Al-Mansur, founded a new city called Baghdad, built on the banks of the Tigris River in old Mesopotamia near the Persian frontier. Now we're set up to look at what is the first stage of the history of science in the Islamic world. And that is a widespread, broad-based, long-lasting translation movement. From about 750 until about the year 1000, text after text after text of Greek, Syriac, Persian, Hindi writings were translated into Arabic. Now, there are 4 questions I want us to consider about this translation movement. The first one, where was it done? Where was the translating done? 2, translation doesn't do itself. Who did the translating? 3, what sort of things were actually translated? What were the books that were being brought into Arabic? And 4th, perhaps most importantly for a historian, why? Translation movement used up vast amounts of resources and people's times. Why was it so important? Well, on the topic of the translation movement, I would just like to mention that one writer, Al-Kindi, for example, an Arabic writer in Baghdad in the 9th century, wrote that it was important to learn the truth wherever we find it, even if it's in different languages, even if we learn it from peoples and in cultures who are very different from us. So that's in the 9th century. So that's sort of an encapsulation of the translation movement. Well, let's start with where the work was done. Much of it was done in Baghdad. There were actually 4 Abbasid caliphs who were important in this endeavor. Al-Mansur, the founder of Baghdad, his son and successor, Al-Mahdi, the great Harun al-Rashid, and Al-Ma'mun. These span a time from about 750 to the middle of the 9th century, to 833. They were chief promoters and patrons of this work. Now, an Arab historian, Ibn Khaldun, writing in the 14th century about the translation movement, has the following to say. He says that once the Arabs developed a sedentary culture, that is, as opposed to nomadic life, they began to become interested in philosophical subjects, as he says, which they had heard about from Christian priests. And so he says that Al-Mansur wrote to the Greek emperor in Constantinople and asked for copies of Greek philosophical, natural philosophical, mathematical works. What did the emperor send? Well, one of the first things he sent was, of all things, Euclid's Elements. And that was one of the first books translated into Arabic. Now, we may debate, historians may debate whether Ibn Khaldun had his history right, but nonetheless, it gives us a sense of the ethos of the Arabic world towards translation. The caliphs patronized the work with money, first of all, of course, and also with places to work, but they weren't the only patrons. Physicians often sponsored the translation of medical writings, such as those of Galen and Hippocrates, for their own uses. There were also 3 sons of a man by the name of Musa ibn Shakir. Supposedly began life as a highway robber, but eventually befriended the caliph and was brought to the court. He died shortly thereafter, and his 3 sons, Muhammad, Ahmed, and Al-Hassan, were raised by the caliph. They were his wards. These 3 sons, called the Banu Musa, the sons of Musa, were celebrated engineers. They cut water channels around Baghdad, did things for irrigation in old Mesopotamia, now Iraq. They were also very lavish patrons of the translation movement in 9th century Baghdad. They also wrote a book on technological devices in the style of Hero of Alexandria, clever devices like a flask that could pour 3 different liquids if you pour it in different directions, self-trimming wicks in oil lamps, all kinds of funny automata, the kind of thing that Hero of Alexandria liked as well. One of the things that we have to think about is that the output of books in Baghdad was very high, which argues for a fairly highly literate culture. Now, the moment we talk about the output of anything, we have to think about, well, wait a minute, anything is made of something. What are books made out of? Well, one technological advance that the Arabs got as war booty, actually, was the knowledge of how to make paper. Paper production was revealed by some Chinese prisoners of war. They bought their freedom with it in 751. By the end of the 8th century, we know certainly by 794, a paper mill was in active production in Baghdad. Now, paper didn't make it to Europe for several centuries after that. The Europeans were still writing on parchment. But paper is, of course, quicker and cheaper to produce than parchment by far. All right. Well, one other thing I should mention. The caliphs patronized an institution in Baghdad called the Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. What the House of Wisdom actually was is a little bit hard to say. We don't have much really clear information about it, but it seems to have been a place for keeping records, a library, and a number of scholars worked there doing translation. Maybe we want to compare it to the museum and the library at Alexandria. Maybe it was something like that. Nonetheless, a lot of the translators I'm about to tell you about worked there or were affiliated with it in some way. All right, next question. Who did the translating? Well, it was a great mixed bag of people. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Sabians, Arabs, Persians, Greeks, Syrians, all kinds of people were involved in the translation movement. And they were all very well paid. We have accounts of how much they were paid, and they became quite well-to-do on the basis of translating. So there must have been a lot of interest for this. Let me mention two translators in particular. One notable one is by the name of Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Now, Hunayn ibn Ishaq was a Nestorian Christian. I should explain what a Nestorian Christian is. A Nestorian Christian is one who emphasizes the humanity of Christ over his divinity. They were considered heretical by the Orthodox Church. As a result of being considered heretical, they moved away from where the Byzantines could get at them, that is basically into Mesopotamia, even to what's now Afghanistan and northern India. So they lived there in the Islamic world with their schools and had a lot of Greek books as well. Well, we have, by his own account, over 100 books that Hunayn translated. He translated essentially all of Galen, 15 books of Hippocrates, 3 books of Plato, including the Timaeus. His son, in fact, Ishaq ibn Hunayn, just reverse the names, and his nephew Hubaysh also were translators, so it was sort of a family affair. Hunayn also made an expedition to the Byzantine Empire to collect more manuscripts to translate. Another translator of about the same time was Thabit ibn Qurra, lived in the second half of the 9th century. He was a Sabian. Now, I've mentioned the Sabians once before, and you may wonder, what on earth is a Sabian? Well, it's a little difficult to say at this point what a Sabian is or was, because there are about 20 different groups that claimed to be Sabians. Why did everyone want to be a Sabian? Well, because in the Quran, it says that there are 4 people of the book. That is, 4 religions that have a true revelation and a text, a divine text given to them by God. Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Sabians. And so, if you could claim to be a Sabian, you got a certain level of religious protection in the Islamic world because of that Quranic verse. Now, we think that the Sabians, the original Sabians, had a sort of astral religion that was based on the old Babylonian and Persian religions, star worship, that sort of thing. At any rate, Thabit ibn Qurra came from the city of Haran, which was a center for the Sabians. He knew Syriac, Greek, and Arabic. And he also wrote influential texts on astronomy, which we'll talk about later. His nephew, son, and grandson were also translators. He was actually brought to Baghdad by Muhammad ibn Musa ibn Shakir, one of the Banu Musa. It says that he actually started out in life as a money changer, and he was met in the market, and his facility with languages was recognized, and so that's why he was brought to the court. Now, we've talked about where it was done, by whom. We've mentioned some of the texts that were translated. How about why? Why did the Islamic Empire, why were the caliphs paying all this money? Why did the Banu Musa pay all this money to have translations of Greek texts into Arabic? Well, there are probably a number of reasons. First of all, like Christians, Muslims have a holy book, the Quran. And so once you have a text, you need interpretational tools. Just as the Christians found they could use the Greek philosophical writings and natural philosophical writings to interpret the Bible, so too Muslims could use the same writings to help with the Quran. Again, knowing phenomena of the world, things about the natural world, helps you interpret. Again, just as when Christianity became more settled and more intellectual, it started having internal strife and needed to turn its attention to resolving theological disputes both within and without Christianity. Islam was the same thing. Muslims had to develop a method of dialectic, how to debate. And here we have a good story that will illustrate one of the reasons at least one text was translated into Arabic. We have it on pretty good authority that the Caliph al-Mahdi in 782 ordered the translation of Aristotle's Topics. And it was translated by the Nestorian patriarch Timothy I. Why? Well, the Topics is all about how to engage in argument. What are the rules of engagement? What are the illustrations, the kind of arguments you use? Well, sure enough, after Timothy translated this work, He was amazed one day to have an audience with the Caliph, who engaged him in theological dispute using the methods of Aristotle. So clearly one of the reasons that Caliph was interested in Aristotle was to help promote Islam by learning a method of argumentation. By the way, Timothy says that even though the Caliph denied the divinity of Christ, he was able to argue for the truth of Christianity over the Caliph. And apparently the debate was very friendly between the two of them. At any rate, there were some aspects of early Islamic culture as well that saw the study of nature as a religious obligation. There's a hadith, that is a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, that says, seek knowledge even if it's in China, with the meaning that knowledge is such a good thing that no matter how far you have to go to get it, it's worth it. So people who wanted to have an intellectual turn to Islam, who were interested in intellectual affairs, the study of the natural world, could use a hadith like that to justify their actions. But again, like in Christianity, besides the theological, philosophical reasons, there are also very, very practical ones. For example, Muslims pray 5 times a day, facing the city of Mecca. That direction is called the Qibla. Now, how do you find the Qibla? Well, if you think about a map, do it right now. You think, okay, let's say you're a Muslim, you want to face Mecca. Well, Mecca's in the east, so you face east, right? Well, no, because the earth is spherical. So the shortest distance between where you are and where Mecca is not a straight line on a flat map. It would be a great circle. So it would actually, from the east coast of the United States, be pointing largely northwards. Now, in order to find your Qibla, that means you need to know a lot of spherical trigonometry and geometry to figure out what the direction actually is. And as the Islamic Empire gets larger and larger and you get further and further away from Mecca, those calculations get more and more difficult. So there's a very practical reason for knowing Greek mathematics and geography as well. There's always the question of the calendar. Now, the Muslim calendar is lunar, not solar. Knowing something about the phases of the moon helps. Now, it happens to be a rule in Islam that you have to actually see the crescent moon to know, for example, when the month of Ramadan is over, when months start and end. Nonetheless, it doesn't hurt to know when to start looking. Right? So you need to know something about the lunar phases as well. Now, there were also non-theological reasons that played a role. There was a political utility here. The Islamic Empire had spread over a huge number of peoples. Peoples with their own cultures, with their own traditions. As a means of unifying the Islamic Empire, what better way than to adopt the cultures, adopt the intellectual traditions of the peoples that you've conquered? And so, learn about what the Greeks think and how the Greeks think. You've got all these Nestorian Christians in your midst. You've got all these Orthodox Christians in your midst. Learn about their traditions as well. This was particularly important for the Abbasids because their political support didn't come from Muslim Arabs in general. They came mostly from the non-Arab parts of the Islamic Empire, Persians in particular. So we find that the Abbasids, just as the Umayyads did before with the Greeks, in the Abbasid court, many of the administrators were Persians. In fact, in the founding of the city of Baghdad, we know the exact date, the day and the month that Baghdad was founded, the 30th of July, 762. How do we know it so precisely? Because it was an astrologically propitious date that was chosen by the court astrologer. Naubacht was his name. He was the astrologer for Al-Mansur, the caliph. Well, think, you're setting up a new capital city in old Mesopotamia near the Persian frontier where the people have for centuries been interested in astrological speculation, the finding of propitious dates. Set your capital based on a date one of them chose. Very clever. Al-Mansur was a clever fellow. There's also an inherent utility, especially to things like medicine. Greek medical texts, Galen and Hippocrates, were very highly sought after. They were some of the first works that were translated into Arabic. Greek mathematics as well. Translations of Euclid, Euclid's Elements, were translated several times. The works of Archimedes, works of Apollonius, and a whole lot of other Greek mathematicians, useful for very practical purposes like accounting and surveying, engineering. The Islamic world had a lot to do with engineering to maintain its systems of communication and administration. Greek astronomy, besides for use for finding the hours, the times of prayer, and the Qibla, was also useful for other calendrical purposes, as well as for horoscopy and prognostication. Remember, astrology is part and parcel of astronomy from the very beginning. It's a very important point, and we'll come back to talk about that. Engineering texts as well were extremely important. We have accounts of several very interesting technological works which were developed in the Islamic world. I've already mentioned the Banu Musa, who worked on hydraulic engineering for irrigating the fields in Mesopotamia. The northern reaches of the Tigris and the Euphrates were the breadbasket of Baghdad, basically. They were their Midwest, so to speak. And lots of grain was grown there, and you had to water the crops naturally. But it turns out that there, the corn was ground straight away in floating factories on the rivers. Now, this is something that's new for Arabic culture. We don't see any example like this in the Greek world. But apparently there were moored vessels on the Tigris with water wheels, and the water rushing underneath would cause the wheels to turn. And there was a whole series of these that could be used to grind grain. It's been estimated that they would produce about 50 tons of flour a day in a 24-hour period. A huge amount of flour. Then it could be loaded into barges. It would sail down the river to Baghdad, and Baghdad would be supplied with food, with grain. Well, having looked over the translation movement, we can sum up and say that by about the year 1000, almost every piece of Greek natural philosophical, mathematical, philosophical literature that was available to the Arab world had been translated into Arabic. So by about the year 1000. Now, what we don't want to go away thinking is that the Islamic world was just a receptacle for Greek knowledge. It was much, much more than that. What I've talked about in this lecture is only the first phase, the phase of appropriation and assimilation. From the beginning, there were also unique, original contributions by Arabic writers. And that's what we need to talk about in the next couple of lectures. The next lecture, I'm going to talk about astronomy and mathematics and optics. Three fields, all mathematical fields that were developed first in the Greek world, but then developed much further in the Islamic world. So there we'll be able to see very clearly some of the contributions, some of the discrete and examples of Islamic additions. After that, we'll talk about alchemy, one of my favorite topics in the Islamic world, and medicine, and then we'll conclude our section on Islam. What I'd like to end with then is the thought that, or rather not the thought, but the notion that we really still are only beginning to scratch the surface of what's going on in the Islamic world. There's still a great deal more, and so I must warn you that all the things I have to say, much of them are still tentative. There are lots of texts in Arabic that still need to be read. Nonetheless, what we have already is very compelling for the importance of Islamic civilization, and that's what we'll look at next.